Okay, well, before I start qualifying my praise all over the place, let me start by celebrating the unrivaled power of the 1611 authorized version. Power that derives from the special state of the English language in the early 17th century. In that period, according to Dwight MacDonald, Englishmen were using words more passionately, richly, vigorously, wittily, and sublimely than ever before or since, and the result was a triumph. Nevertheless, as Robert Alter suggests in the preface to his translation of the Book of Psalms, the King James Version is supremely poetical, but it is poetical after the fashion of English poetry and not after the fashion of Hebrew poetry, which is terse, compact, even abrupt, and in its unique poetics emphasizes semantic parallelism between the 2 or 3 versets that make up each biblical verse. We could say perhaps that poetry got lost in translation, but it was replaced by a transfusion of energy from early modern English, leaving the texts changelings that only vaguely resemble their originals. My argument today will be that the same is true of the King James Version's translation of biblical prose narrative. It does what English prose does very well, but what it does is not what the ancient Hebrew prose does. There is a prosaics as well as a poetics of biblical literature. If the latter is based on semantic parallelism of the versets, the former often rests on themes based on key words. Leitwörter was what Martin Buber called them, that appear again and again in the narrative passage to structure its meaning. This prosaics defies translation into any language unless the range and ambiguity of the Hebrew words can be duplicated in the language into which it is translated. In particular, it defies translation into English because of the amazingly various vocabulary of English, which encourages paraphrases, using variant signifiers rather than the same one each time the Hebrew signifier appears. Now, this is not to say that there are no mistranslations in the King James Version, but most of them derive from previous translations of the Bible back to the 3rd century BCE that had in effect made the 1611 crew's decisions for them. Of these mistranslations, the most famous involves that young woman in Isaiah 7:14 who conceives and bears a son and names him Emmanuel, God with us. The immediate context is Isaiah's assurance to Ahaz, the king of Judah, letting him know that God is with him and his people. Because before that child is more than a toddler, Isaiah claims, Aram and Israel, the 2 kingdoms currently making war against Judah, will no longer trouble him. It was the translators of the Septuagint, about 500 years later, who decided to render the Hebrew Alma, young woman, as Parthenos, virgin, rather than using the less specific word neanis, which is the more usual Greek word for Alma. And it was the evangelist known as Matthew, or his sources, who decided to use the verse as a proof text for the virgin birth of Yeshua of Nazareth. The Septuagint may not have been endorsing virgin birth, of course. The translation may merely be indicating that the bride who would conceive and bear Emmanuel was a virgin at the time of her wedding, as all nice Judean girls were supposed to be. Another highly misleading passage appears in the book of Job, 19:25 and 26. For I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. And though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh shall I see God. In King James's English, this passage is a beautiful testimony, made even more beautiful set to Handel's music in Messiah, to an ever-living God who promises not only life after death, but a resurrection in the body. But unfortunately, that is not what the Hebrew says. The word goel can be translated redeemer in the context of the manumission of a slave. But in the context of wrongful death, it signifies the family member designated to take vengeance on behalf of the slain. Given Job's ongoing lawsuit against God, the Goel is a kinsman from some future time who Job predicts will rise up, Yakum, on behalf of Job's dust, Afar, to prosecute the case long after his death. In fact, Job had already explicitly rejected any life after death. In chapter 14 he says, "So man lieth down, and riseth not. Till the heavens be no more, they shall not awake, nor be raised out of their sleep." And if Job is momentarily entertaining a fugitive notion of being somehow aware of this post-mortem justice, he is certainly not thinking in terms of a resurrection in the body. The word mibasari, which the King James Version renders "in my flesh," actually means "out of my flesh." But the Hebrew text is difficult to construe. The Septuagint and the Targum lend no help, and any reading requires some heavy-duty speculation. The one story in Genesis that gets warped by the King James Version in an entirely avoidable way is the story in Genesis 27 of the deception of Isaac and the blessings of Jacob and Esau. It is in your handout. The blind patriarch Isaac has sent his firstborn and favorite son Esau to hunt for game and to make a savory stew before he, Isaac, gives his ancestral blessing. Hearing this, Rebekah incites her own favorite twin, Jacob, to masquerade as his brother, dressing him in Esau's clothing with Esau's unique aroma, animal skins added to mimic Esau's hairy hands and neck. Isaac is a bit suspicious. The voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. But he is fooled by the stew Rebekah has made, and despite his doubts, he gives Jacob the blessing, which begins in Hebrew, Yitein lecha ha'elohim mitar hashamayim u'mishmanei ha'aretz. God give thee of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth. No sooner has he done so when Esau comes back with the real venison stew. And as soon as Isaac hears the voice of Esau, he realizes his mistake. And then the focus shifts to the other recognition, Esau's, that Jacob has stolen the blessing meant for him. Et bechorati lakach v'hinei ata lakach et birchati, Esau says. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he hath taken away my blessing. These two words, blessing and birthright, beracha and bechorah, are consonantal anagrams in Hebrew. Then Esau plaintively asks Isaac whether there cannot be a blessing for him too. But Isaac has already made Jacob lord over his brethren, and he cannot take back what he has given. Esau persists, "Bless me too, my father," and bursts into tears. And so Isaac blesses Esau too. Mishmanei ha'aretz yihiyeh moshavecha, u'mital hashamayim mima'al, Isaac begins, which the King James Version renders as, "Thy dwelling shall be the fatness of the earth, and of the dew of heaven from above." But that isn't what Isaac is saying. He is playing on the language of Jacob's blessing, with two of the same key phrases, Shmanei ha'aretz, Tal hashamayim. But with a subtle change of the verb, Isaac indicates that these are exactly what Esau is not to receive. Isaac's words mean, your dwellings shall be far from the fatness of the land, far from where the dew of heaven falls from above. Isaac's play on words hinges on the ambivalent nature of the preposition mean, which is like the French preposition de. With a verb like give, it is partitive. God should give Jacob some of the dew from heaven, some of the fatness of the land. But with a verb of motion, or a copula, like yihiyeh, mean means from in a directional sense, far from. This shift in meaning clarifies the rest of Esau's blessing. For why should Esau live by his sword if he could live well by farming? And why would Esau want to kill Jacob if their blessings were substantially identical? The King James Version has purloined part of the point of the narrative. But of course they were not the first to do so. The Bishop's Bible of 1564, which the 1611 crew was revising, has the same misconstruction of mean. Behold, thy dwelling shall be the fatness of the earth, and of the dew of heaven from above. Tyndall in 1530 has a similar translation. Going back to Wycliffe, 1395, we get the same reading of this part of the story, though it is dramatized more than usual. And when Esau wept with great yelling, Isaac was stirred, and said to him, The blessing shall be in the fatness of earth, and in the dew of heaven from above. Thou shalt live by sword, and thou shalt serve thy brother, and time shall come when thou shalt shake away, and unbind his yoke for the nollis. The misreading goes all the way back to the Vulgate. Only the Septuagint has it right, using apo with its combination of meanings, separation from and origin of, to convey the sense of the Hebrew mean. Apo tes piotetos tes geis estai hekatois cases. Kai apo tes drosu tu ar uranu enothen. Isaac's wordplay here is hard to capture even in languages like French, where the partitive and directional prepositions overlap. It's like an enharmonic change in a musical composition, where the note is the same, but the harmonic context shifts beneath us. Now, the more complex passage that I'd like to discuss for the rest of my time, also in your handout, is the section from Genesis 32 and 33, where the stolen blessing is repaid with interest about 20 years later. It is a passage where the language itself in the original Hebrew seems to generate the action, as the chain of signifiers, their relatives and anagrams, gives rise to action, to deeds, as well as thoughts and other words. The immediate context here is that Jacob, having left Laban and Paddan Aram, is on his way back to the land of his forefathers. 20 years before, at Bethel, he had seen angels, malachim, ascending a heavenly ladder. And here, on the return journey, Jacob again sees angels, God's host. The word for host is machaneh, which means camp, or the army ensconced in that camp. And so he names that site Machanayim, twin camps. The unusual dual form reminds us that Jacob too is a twin, with unfinished business with his twin brother Esau. And so it is not surprising that Jacob sends messengers, also malachim in Hebrew, to his brother, addressing Esau as my lord, and referring to himself as thy servant, abasing himself before his elder brother, but also stressing, perhaps a bit tactlessly, the great wealth that has come his way since he had hurriedly left for Aram. He also asks for grace, chen, spelled with the two consonants that are in the middle of Machanayim. But Jacob's messengers return from their mission reporting that they met up with Esau, who was armed and dangerous, and giving no clue to his intentions. At this point, the name of the site, Machanayim, twin camps, suggests a defense strategy to Jacob. So he divides his caravan of wives, children, servants, and livestock into two camps, machanot, so that if Esau should strike one, the other may escape. His second defensive strategy is to pray to the Lord, mentioned here for the first and only time, reminding him of the pact that they had made at Bethel, and that he counts on divine favor now, since at Bethel he had nothing but his herdsman's staff, but now his household is two camps. And it is as though when Jacob uses in his prayer the word for camp, machaneh, that a consonantal anagram of that word occurs to him. While he and his family are encamped, he will send a mincha, a present, to Esau to buy peace. In fact, he sends a series of presents addressed to my lord Esau from his servant Jacob, but it seems to be a payoff rather than a plea for chen, grace, for that word is nowhere in the accompanying message. Now the next sequence in the pericope is the pericope usually referred to as the wrestling with the angel, although the word for angel, malach, used liberally earlier in the chapter, does not actually appear there. A handful of other key words compete for our attention instead, of which I will have time to mention only two. One is the word for wrestle. Jacob in Hebrew is Yaakov, and wrestled in the third person masculine singular is Yaavok. Both of them sound like the tributary of the Jordan where the match takes place, the bank of the Yavok. The other is the word for face, panim. After Jacob is renamed Israel, he renames the place of the wrestling Peniel or Penuel, both meaning face of God, because he confronted God face to face and lived. But the face theme is not limited to this pericope. In fact, it had started appearing insistently earlier. At verse 32:20b, as Jacob reveals what he hopes his presence to Esau will accomplish, he says, it's on the backward side, the other side of the handout, he says, I will appease him with the present that goes before me. Perhaps he will accept of me. What reads in the King James Version is, I will appease him, is akapara panav. Literally, I will cover his face. Before me is lefanai, before my face. He will accept of me is yisa panai. He will lift my face. Jacob can confront God, but it's still an open question whether he can confront Esau face to face and live. So the face theme continues, as we shall shortly see, into the climactic scene where Jacob and Esau meet. The morning after the wrestling, Jacob is damaged physically and changed in other ways also, perhaps, by his new name and by the special blessing wrestled from his divine antagonist. As Esau and his entourage draw near, Jacob again divides his household, with the handmaids in front and his darling Rachel and Joseph at the rear. But now it is not a defensive maneuver. Instead, Jacob stands in front of them all, bowing down to his brother Esau 7 times, his face to the earth, in allusion to the stolen blessing given by Isaac that his mother's sons would bow to him. And in responding, Esau immediately lifts Jacob's face. In fact, he falls on his neck and kisses him. Part of the tension is gone once the threat of fratricide is over. But the question is still open whether there can be genuine forgiveness and grace, chen. Esau asks after Jacob's family, and the wives and children come in reverse order of rank to bow down before their new kinsman. The children, Jacob says, were his by God's grace. Finally, Esau asks about that machaneh, which is what he calls that drove of livestock that met him all along the way. What was that all about? To find favor, chen, in your eyes, Jacob answers. To Esau, this is not satisfactory. Chen cannot be purchased, and he rejects the gift. I have enough, he says. Let what is yours remain yours. Clearly, Jacob needs to find some way that Esau can accept, so he turns it around. Esau's acceptance of the gift will be the sign that grace has been freely granted. Nay, I pray thee, if now I have found grace in thy sight, then receive my present, minchati, at my hand. And in allusion to the night of wrestling, Jacob adds, I have seen thy face, panecha, as though I had seen the face of God, Pnei Elohim, and thou wast pleased with me. And finally, he shifts the terms of the exchange. He has called it a mincha, a gift, tribute sent between hostile camps. But now Jacob renames it a bracha, a blessing, as if he could thus retroactively undo his theft of Isaac's blessing. In chapter 27, Esau had complained to Isaac, Lakach et birchati. Jacob has taken away my blessing. And now Jacob says, Kach na et birchati, take, I pray thee, my blessing. And this restitution Esau is willing to accept. All is now settled between the twins, signaled by the disappearance of both mincha and machaneh from the vocabulary. Only chen remains. Perhaps the night of wrestling and renaming has changed Jacob permanently. But as we watch Jacob maneuver to avoid the company of Esau and his raiders, as his caravan continues the journey into Canaan, he may still remind us of the trickster figure who bought his brother's birthright for that mess of pottage. For one thing, Jacob is still one blessing ahead. And there's perhaps some significance in the way each of the twins defines his success. Both are translated in the King James Version as, I have enough. But in the Hebrew, Esau says, Yesh li rav, I have plenty. Whereas Jacob says, Yesh li kol, I've got it all. He does have it all now, though not for long. The successive chapters to come will cost him his daughter Dinah, his wife Rachel, and his son Joseph. But those are stories for another day. Backing up from the meeting of Jacob and Esau to the prosaics in which the story is told, you can see that most of this elaborate pattern invariably gets lost in translation. The relation between machaneh and mincha, and both of these with chen, is visible only in the consonantal Hebrew text. And of course, these words themselves disappear into the variety of ways they can be translated into English. The word machaneh, for example, is rendered in these two chapters as host, band, company, and drove. Elsewhere in the King James Version, it is also rendered as camp, armies, tents, and battle. The word panim is usually rendered face when alone, but it combines with verbs and particles into a dizzying number of idioms. Nor does a single Hebrew word match each English word. In this passage, drove is used to translate machaneh in 33:8, but in the previous chapter, drove was the translation for eder. The King James Version's translation of this Hebrew narrative loses something more than just nuance here, I think. Some loss is inevitable, but some can be recaptured using a different theory of translation. The translations of the Hebrew Bible into German by Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig, and the Everett Fox translation of the 5 books of Moses into English work on the same principle, which is that of fidelity to the Shoreshim, the Hebrew roots, translating each root consistently by the same word of German and English, respectively. But of course, when you do that, you're not writing idiomatic German or English anymore. Translations usually attempt to bring the reader closer to the text, but the Buber and Fox translations do just the opposite. They create an alienation effect. We are very aware that we are reading a translation, aware that the thou who speaks is other to the I who reads. Connecting with that thou is difficult, but sometimes that very strangeness, those rough edges, allow us to realize how the passage we are reading connects up with other passages, ones nearby or very distant, as when 2nd Isaiah uses a rare word, tohu, alluding to the primordial state of matter in the 1st chapter of Genesis. The King James Version gives us English speakers an intense brush with the sublime, and one that is passed into our common speech. The alienating strangeness of the Buber and Fox translations can sometimes bring us, as Martin Buber wished, to an awareness of the transcendent. In my own teaching of biblical narrative, I have made a feeble attempt to duplicate the alienation effect merely by refusing to assign specific editions with a preferred translation. As the students and I read together, inevitably there will be moments when our translations clash, when we become aware that translations are approximations, and that we need to turn to the original Hebrew and Greek to hear more precisely the song that the story is singing. Thank you.
Thank you.